The janitor pushed his cart past the marble columns of the embassy lobby, invisible as always. 11 months of polished floors. 11 months of no one learning his name. Then on the third floor, a voice cracked through the corridor. The interpreter never made it. The delegation lands in 40 minutes. A classified meeting. A Saudi delegation that had already walked away once. An ambassador staring at the collapse of 2 years of quiet work. The janitor set down his mop and knocked on the conference room door. Deputy Attaché Marcus Webb looked up. "Can I help you?" "Ani Madaber Ivrit," Daniel said, in Hebrew, fluently. The Israeli embassy in Washington sat behind reinforced gates on a quiet residential street, 4 floors of pale stone and tinted glass, the kind of building most people walked past without ever wondering what happened inside it. Daniel Avraham worked the graveyard rotation, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, pushing his cart through corridors where the carpet had been replaced 3 times in the last decade and where the security cameras blinked in slow, patient rhythm. He had been doing this for 11 months. In that time, no one above the 2nd floor had learned his name. He had stopped expecting them to. He was 47 years old, lean in the way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation, and he wore the dark blue coveralls the building services contractor issued every 6 months. The patch over his chest pocket said simply, D. Avraham. Most people read the patch and nothing else. A few nodded. Most stepped around his cart the way they would step around a piece of office equipment that had been left awkwardly in a hallway. He had not always been invisible. There had been 12 years in the Israeli Defense Forces, 8 of them in Unit A2000, the Signals Intelligence Directorate, where he had worked as a senior linguist on Arabic, Persian, and Russian intercepts. He had sat in windowless rooms in Herzliya translating things that men in better suits would later read in better rooms and decide whether to act upon. He had been good at it. He had been more than good at it. After Unit A200, he had been seconded for 3 years to a joint program at the Israeli Embassy in London, where he had carried meaning between languages at tables where the wrong word could cost a man his career, his country's negotiating position, or in one case that he still did not speak about, his life. That life had ended on a rainy Thursday 4 years ago, when a doctor in a cold consultation room in Tel Aviv had explained that his wife Miriam had between 6 and 8 weeks. She had lasted 7. After the funeral, he had looked at the life he was supposed to keep building, and he had understood that he could not build it alone. There was his daughter Talia, who had been 9 years old then and was 13 now. There was the apartment in Bethesda that Miriam had chosen, because it was within walking distance of 3 good schools and a small synagogue. There was the school pickup at 3:15, and the homework at 4, and the dinner at 6 and the bedtime at 9. He had taken the first job that required no travel, and no overtime requests approved weeks in advance. The building services contractor had hired him the same week he applied. They had not asked why a man with his resume wanted to mop floors. He had not offered. He had told his daughter that he was working for the embassy now, which was true in a way that did not require further explanation, and his daughter at 13 had understood enough not to press the question. She knew her father had once worked for the Israeli government. She did not know what he had done. She knew only that he came home every morning at 7:30, that he made her breakfast before he slept, that he was awake again by 2 to drive her home from school, and that he had not missed a single parent-teacher conference in 4 years. On the morning the world rearranged itself, Daniel was emptying the recycling bins on the 3rd floor at 20 minutes to 8. The conference room at the end of the eastern corridor was already lit from within its frosted glass walls, fogged faintly from the climate system, trying to hold a temperature against the heat of too many bodies and too much pressure. He did not look inside. Looking inside was not something the coveralls permitted. Ambassador Hadis Reichman stood at the head of the long walnut conference table, her phone pressed so hard against her ear that the edge of the case had left a faint, pale line along her jaw. She was 56, the 3rd woman to hold the post in the embassy's history, and she had spent the last 14 months building toward a conversation that was supposed to happen this morning. The delegation from Riyadh had landed at Dulles the night before. They were already moving through the city in 2 unmarked vehicles. They would arrive at the embassy in less than 40 minutes. "What do you mean he's in surgery?" Hadis said into the phone, her voice level in the way that meant inside she was not. "Is he conscious? Can he travel? Can he speak?" The answer on the other end took a long time to arrive, and when it did not contain any of the words she needed. She ended the call and set the phone down on the table with a care that suggested she wanted to throw it and had decided against the satisfaction. Marcus Webb, her deputy chief of mission, was already reaching for his own device. "I'll call every cleared interpreter on the East Coast Registry," he said. "Someone has to be available." "In 38 minutes, Hadas said. "I'll try. Try fast." Marcus tried fast. The first 3 names on the registry were unreachable. The 4th was in Boston and could not be in Washington before noon. The 5th answered and asked what subject matter. Marcus told him. As much as the unsecured line allowed. The man said he was not cleared for that subject matter and apologized and hung up. The 6th had retired in March and had not updated his profile. By 8 o'clock, Marcus had made 9 calls, and Hadas had watched the clock above the door advance with the slow mercilessness of a thing that did not care who was watching. Yael Kaufman, the ambassador's chief of staff for 11 years, stood near the credenza with a tablet pressed to her chest. "His office is asking whether we want to postpone," she said quietly. Specifically, the prince's chief of protocol. He used the word again. Hadas closed her eyes for a moment. The word the prince's chief of protocol had used was seriousness. It was the same word he had used 8 months ago, the morning the prince's delegation had walked out of the residence in Paris because a contract translator had rendered a single phrase about regional security guarantees in language that the prince had read as imprecise. The delegation had returned to Riyadh that afternoon and refused all further contact for 19 weeks. Getting them back to a conference table had taken every favor Hadas had built in 2 careers. Losing them now, for the same reason, would not be a setback. It would be the end. Outside the frosted glass, Daniel was wheeling his cart past the row of secured printers when he heard the word Riyadh, through the open door of the smaller staff office adjacent to the conference room. It was a word he knew. He slowed his cart. What reached him next was not the word, but the tone. It was the tone of a woman trying to keep an institution from falling through a hole in the floor. He heard Marcus's voice rising with the specific exhaustion of a man whose phone had stopped being useful. He heard Yael say the word protocol twice. He heard the ambassador say, very quietly, "Then we lose them again." Daniel stood beside his cart for a long moment. He thought about the coveralls. He thought about the 11 months he had spent in this building without anyone above the 2nd floor learning his name. He thought about his daughter, who would be eating cereal at the apartment in Bethesda right now, and about the parent-teacher conference scheduled for Tuesday, and about the fact that what he was about to do would either be the most foolish moment of his adult life, or the one moment he would later recognize as the door that had opened for him while everyone else was busy shutting theirs. He pushed the cart against the wall, straightened the collar of his coveralls as if that would make any difference at all, and walked to the conference room door. He knocked once. Every head turned. Marcus's expression shifted immediately toward the impatience people reserve for on-floor deliveries. "I don't mean to interrupt," Daniel said. His voice was quieter than he had planned, but steady. "I heard you need an interpreter. I speak Hebrew, Arabic, and English. I'm cleared." Marcus let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "We're in the middle of something. Maintenance issues go through the service desk on the ground floor." "I worked 8 years in Unit 8200, Daniel said. 3 years on secondment to the embassy in London, including 2 on the Gulf desk. I held a top-secret clearance through 2021. I can do this meeting." The room had gone entirely still, Yael's tablet lowered by an inch. Marcus's face did something complicated. "With respect," Marcus said, "we're about to put a classified bilateral conversation on a table with one of the most particular counterparties in the region, and you want us to put a janitor in the chair." Daniel did not flinch. He had been called worse things in better rooms. "I am not asking you to put a janitor in the chair," he said. "I am telling you that the interpreter you needed is already in the building." Marcus turned to Hadas. "Ambassador, this is not a conversation we are seriously having." Hadas had not yet looked away from Daniel. She was studying his face the way a person studies a face she is trying to remember, whether she has seen before. "Mr. Avraham," she said. The use of his name from the patch on his chest landed in the room with a weight that Marcus did not appear to register, but Yael did. Where in Unit A2000? Herzliya. Building 4, section under Colonel Ben Ari until his retirement. And before that? 2 years at the language school in Mitzpe Ramon, Hebrew University before that, Arabic and Persian linguistics. Hadas was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Yael, please bring Mr. Avraham a jacket and a tie from the staff wardrobe. Mr. Webb, please call the gate and tell them the prince's vehicles are to be received with the standard honors. We have an interpreter. Marcus did not move for a full second. Then he said, Ambassador, I have to register a formal objection to this on the record. Register it, Hadas said, in writing, after the meeting. Yael moved. Daniel followed her down the corridor to the staff wardrobe, a narrow room behind the second elevator bank that contained 6 identical dark suits in graduated sizes, 4 white shirts, and a small selection of muted ties. She handed him a 42 regular, a shirt that was almost the right collar size, and a tie the color of slate. She did not ask him to change in front of her. She closed the door and waited in the corridor. When he came out, he looked like a man who had worn this kind of clothing for most of his adult life, because he had. The coveralls hung on the hook behind the door like something that had been left there by a stranger. Yael looked at him for a moment. Mr. Avraham, she said, I have worked in this building for 11 years. May I ask why I have never seen you above the 2nd floor? Because I work the night shift, he said, and because nobody on the 3rd floor needed to see me until 40 minutes ago. She nodded once. She did not say anything else. They walked back to the conference room together. The Saudi delegation arrived at 8:43. The lead vehicle came through the gate first, followed by the second, and the protocol officers were already in position on the steps when the doors opened. Prince Faisal bin Saud al-Mutairi stepped out of the second vehicle, not the first. A small protocol move that meant the delegation was treating this meeting as exploratory rather than committed. His chief of protocol, a thin man named Khalid al-Rashid, exited the first vehicle and crossed the gravel ahead of the prince to make the introductions. The prince was 61. He had a face that had been described in 3 intelligence briefings. Daniel had read as the face of a man who had decided early in life that the people across the table from him would be the ones to start the conversation. He wore a charcoal suit cut in London and a watch that Daniel recognized from a photograph in a 2018 brief. The introductions in the lobby were handled in English, which was protocol for an arrival, but which everyone in the room understood would not be the language of the meeting itself. Hadas greeted the prince warmly and not effusively. The prince responded in measured English with the slight British vowels of a man who had read Greats at Oxford 40 years earlier. They moved to the elevators. In the conference room, the seating had already been arranged. The Israeli delegation on the eastern side of the long walnut table, the Saudi delegation on the western side. The interpreter, Daniel, at the short end of the table where he could see both faces. There was a glass of water in front of his place. Nothing else. Khalid al-Rashid took his seat to the prince's right and opened a leather portfolio. He spoke first, in Arabic, addressing Hadas directly. He said, in substance, that the prince's office had been informed that the contracted interpreter was unavailable, and that the prince's office had been further informed that the embassy had located a substitute on short notice, and that the prince's office wished to be assured that this substitute possessed both the technical proficiency and the discretion that this conversation required. He spoke for 43 seconds. He used the formal register. He chose his vocabulary with the precision of a man who was testing the room before the room knew it was being tested. Daniel listened without writing anything down. When Khalid finished, Daniel rendered the entire 43 seconds into Hebrew for Hadas, then into English for the rest of the room, in 2 consecutive passes. He preserved the formal register. He preserved the structure of the sentences. He preserved the small diplomatic ambiguity in the phrase Khalid had used about discretion, which could be read either as a polite request for assurance or as a quiet warning, and he rendered it both ways without choosing for the room which reading was correct. When he finished, Khalid al-Rashid looked at him for the first time as a person rather than as a piece of furniture. He said one sentence, in Arabic, directly to Daniel. "Where did you train?" "Mitzpe Ramon in Hebrew University," Daniel said, in Arabic. "Then 12 years in service." The last 3 on the Gulf desk. Khalid nodded once. He turned to the prince and said, in Arabic, "He's fine." Then he closed his portfolio and the meeting began. The first 90 minutes of the meeting moved through the items that both delegations had agreed in advance could be discussed: trade corridors, joint research initiatives at 2 universities, a humanitarian framework for medical evacuations through a 3rd country. These were the items the world was allowed to know about. They were the warm-up. At 10:15, the prince closed the folder in front of him and said, in Arabic, "I would like to speak now about the matter that brought us here." Daniel rendered the sentence into Hebrew. Hadaz closed her own folder. Marcus, who had been taking notes on a tablet at the far end of the room, set the tablet down. What followed was a 40-minute conversation that Daniel will not describe in detail to anyone for the rest of his life, because the clearance he had carried in 2021 had been reactivated by Yael at 9:12 that morning, under an emergency provision that allowed the ambassador to designate temporary cleared personnel in the case of operational necessity, and because the contents of that conversation were classified at a level that did not permit even its general subject matter to be acknowledged outside of a CIF. What can be said is this. The prince was exploring whether a particular kind of conversation might one day become possible. Hadaz was exploring whether a particular kind of assurance might one day become available. Both of them were doing this through layers of formal Arabic and formal Hebrew that depended, completely and without margin, on the interpreter in the chair at the short end of the table, being able to render not only the words, but the spaces between the words. Daniel rendered the spaces. At one point, roughly an hour into the substantive conversation, the prince said something in Arabic that contained a verb in a tense that, rendered carelessly into Hebrew, would have committed his government to a position it was not yet prepared to take. Daniel rendered the verb in a Hebrew construction that preserved the prince's intended meaning: exploratory, conditional, not committal. And Khalid al-Rashid, who was following every word, glanced at Daniel and let out a breath so small that only the people sitting closest to him would have noticed. Hadaz noticed. 40 minutes after that, when the meeting reached the point where both delegations agreed to put nothing further into the room until certain other conditions had been met by certain other parties, the prince stood. The Saudi delegation stood. The Israeli delegation stood. The prince walked the length of the table to where Hadaz was standing and shook her hand. Then he turned to Daniel. He spoke in Arabic. "Mr. Avraham," he said, "I want to tell you that when I walked into this building this morning, I was prepared to leave by 10:30 if the substitute interpreter was not equal to the conversation. I did not leave at 10:30. I want you to understand that this is not a small thing." Daniel rendered the prince's words into Hebrew for Hadaz, who had understood them, and then into English for Marcus, who had not. The prince was not finished. He continued, in Arabic, "I would also like to know why a man with your training is wearing a janitor's uniform in this building." Daniel rendered the question. Then he answered it, in Arabic, directly to the prince. "Because 4 years ago my wife died, and I have a daughter who is now 13, and the work I used to do required me to be in places where I could not be home by 7:30 in the morning. So I took different work. I do not regret it." The prince looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, in Arabic, "A man who knows what he is, rare." He turned to Hadaz and said, in English, "Ambassador, I will see you again." The delegation left at 10:53. The room emptied slowly, as rooms do after something significant has happened inside them. Yael gathered the folders. The 2 Israeli note-takers drifted back to their floor. Marcus stood near the door for a moment, then walked out without speaking to anyone. Hadaz noted this and filed it away. When it was only the 2 of them left, Hadaz sat down at the end of the long table and motioned for Daniel to sit across from her. "Mr. Avraham," she said, "I owe you an accounting." "You don't owe me anything, Ambassador." "I do. You walked into a room where no one was going to vouch for you, and you prevented what would have been at minimum the loss of a 14-month diplomatic effort, and at maximum the end of this embassy's credibility on the file that matters most to me. I would like to know how a man with your background ended up pushing a cart in my building." Daniel considered the question for a moment, and then he told her. He told her about Herslia, and about Colonel Ben Ari, and about the work he had done on the Gulf desk in London, and about the rainy Thursday 4 years ago, and about the decision that had followed. He told her about the choice to take a job that came home at 7:30 every morning, and why that mattered. He did not tell her everything. Some things belonged only to him. But he told her enough. Hadas listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I want to offer you a position. Senior Interpreter and Translation Advisor to the Office of the Ambassador. It is a title we don't currently have, which means we will design it around you. The hours will be what you and I agree they should be. The compensation will be appropriate to the work. And Mr. Webb will not be in your reporting chain." Daniel looked at her. "May I ask what will happen to Mr. Webb?" "Mr. Webb and I will be having a conversation this afternoon about the difference between caution and obstruction. That conversation has been overdue for some time. Today clarified it." "I see. I'll give you a week to think about the offer." "I don't need a week, Ambassador. I'll accept on one condition." "Name it." "I don't travel overnight. I can do day trips. I can do calls at any hour. But I sleep at home." Hadas inclined her head slightly. "That is not a condition, Mr. Avraham. That is a schedule. I can work with a schedule." She extended her hand. He shook it. He left the building at 11:20 that morning. He rode the metro home the way he had ridden it for 11 months, standing because the train was full, and he preferred standing anyway. He did not call anyone. He walked the 4 blocks from the station to his front door, and he stopped in the hallway just inside the apartment, the way he always did, and he looked at the framed photograph of Miriam on the shelf, and he said nothing out loud, because the conversation they had was not one that required words. His daughter Talia came home at 3:15. He made her a snack. He helped her with her algebra homework. He did not tell her that anything had changed. 2 weeks later, Daniel walked into the embassy at 8 in the morning through the same security checkpoint he had passed through for 11 months at the start of every shift. He was wearing a suit that fit him properly, one he had bought with the signing portion of his new salary, and he carried a leather portfolio under his arm. The security guard at the front desk, a woman named Inez who had nodded at him every morning at 7 for a year without ever using his name, looked up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Avraham." "Good morning, Inez." Inez blinked, because she had not realized he knew her name either. It had been a quiet point of pride for Daniel over the 11 months that he had learned the names of every guard and every fellow custodian on his rotation. It was something nobody had noticed, and something he had done anyway. The elevator took him to the 3rd floor. Yael was waiting at the front desk of the executive suite with a small stack of folders and an embassy badge with his photograph on it. The visitor badge had already been retired. "Ambassador Reichman is on a call until 9, Yael said. "Your office is the 3rd door on the left." Daniel glanced down the corridor. "And Mr. Webb?" "Mr. Webb has been transferred to a posting in Pretoria," Yael said. "It was presented as a lateral opportunity. It wasn't." "I didn't ask for that, Yael." "I know you didn't. The ambassador made that decision on her own. For what it's worth, Mr. Avraham, most of us on this floor think it should have happened a long time ago." He took the badge. He walked down the corridor to the 3rd door on the left. The office was not large, but it had a window. On the desk was a single folder containing the first 3 negotiations Hadas wanted him to advise on, one in Arabic, one in Hebrew, and one in Russian. He had not mentioned that he also spoke Russian. He had not needed to. Someone had done the research. He sat down in the chair, which was a better chair than he had sat in for 4 years, and he looked out the window at a city that looked exactly the same from the 3rd floor of the embassy as it had from the corridor outside it. The city had not changed. He had not changed, not in any way that mattered to him. He was still the same man who woke at 5:30 every morning, who packed a lunch for his daughter before driving her to school, who kept a photograph of his wife on the shelf in the front hallway where he could see it every time he walked through the door. What had changed was that the embassy, which for 11 months had looked past him as if he were a piece of office equipment, had finally looked at him. He had not asked it to. He had simply been ready when it did. He opened the folder. He uncapped his pen. He began to read. 6 months later, the prince's chief of protocol called the embassy on a secured line and asked, by name, whether Mr. Avraham would be available for a particular meeting in a particular city on a particular Tuesday. Hadas relayed the request. Daniel checked his daughter's school calendar, confirmed that Tuesday was a normal school day with no parent-teacher conference, and accepted the assignment as a day trip. He left Washington on the 6 a.m. flight, conducted 4 hours of meetings in a windowless room he is not permitted to describe, and was back in Bethesda by 10:15 that night, in time to read the last chapter of a book to his daughter before she fell asleep. He continued to learn the names of the security guards. He continued to walk the 4 blocks from the metro to his front door. He continued to stop in the hallway and look at the photograph on the shelf and say nothing out loud. The work he did over the next several years would, in a small handful of cases, appear in declassified summaries decades later. In most cases, it would not appear anywhere at all. He preferred it that way. So did the people who hired him. There is a verse in the book of Proverbs that Daniel's father had taught him as a boy in a small kitchen in Haifa more than 40 years ago, on a morning when his father was leaving for work, and Daniel had asked him why he worked so hard at a job that no one ever saw. His father had set down his coffee and looked at him and said, "Because the work is the point. The seeing is not." Then his father had quoted the verse, in Hebrew, the way his own father had taught it to him, and Daniel had carried the verse with him through 12 years in the army and 3 years in London, and 4 years of pushing a cart through corridors where no one had learned his name. He had carried it because he believed it. He had not needed the embassy to look at him in order to believe it. He had only needed the embassy to look at him in order for the verse to come true. Do you see a man skillful in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men. Proverbs 22:29.